Today, the fjords of Norway are a popular tourist destination, but during the Second World War, their majestic beauty cloaked more sinister activities. In 1939, both Germany and the Western Allies had a strategic interest in neutral Norway. The Soviet attack on Finland in November 1939 was initially rebuffed by the Finns. The French and British now wanted to help the embattled Finns, but this would entail sending supplies to Finland through Norway. The Allies also wanted to cut neutral Sweden's trade in iron ore with Germany, which passed through the Norwegian port of Narvik. The German Navy, on the other hand, saw Norway as a useful base for operations against the Royal Navy in the North Sea. But Finland was forced to make peace in March 1940 and to surrender territory to the Russians. Yet the Germans were still concerned over Allied designs on Norway. Thus, on the 6th of April 1940, the German Navy put to sea with the intention of landing troops at various points in Norway. They evaded the Royal Navy, and the landings began 3 days later. Airborne troops also took part in these operations. Having quickly secured Oslo, the capital, the German forces began to advance northwards. The British hastily sent ships and troops to help the Norwegians, and ground forces, including French soldiers, were landed at various points in northern Norway. The Allies did enjoy some success against German ships supporting their troops on shore. But this was to little avail, since the Germans enjoyed overwhelming air supremacy. This enabled them to continue their rapid advance, and the Norwegians and their allies could do little to stop it. One after another of the Allied task forces was forced to evacuate. The final one left Narvik in early June 1940. It was harried from the air as it did so. Among the last to leave were King Haakon and his government, who were brought to Britain in a British cruiser. Here they set up a government in exile, as did other countries which had been overrun. The Norwegian armed forces laid down their arms, and the country joined the growing list of German-occupied territories. Extreme right-wing politician Vidkun Quisling now headed a puppet government, but German Reich Commissar Josef Terboven held the real power in Norway. The majority of the Norwegian people now had to get on with their lives as best they could, within the restrictions placed on them by the occupation forces. Some Norwegians vowed, however, to fight on. Resistance groups were formed in the country. These made contact with the Special Operations Executive in Britain in early 1941 and were organized into the Milorg. This had a strength of 40,000 men and women by the end of the war. Others escaped, usually in fishing boats, across the North Sea. After evading the Germans and battling with the elements, they arrived in British waters.
Where are you from? Very good, Norway. Come alongside.
Once they had been screened, these young men joined the Free Norwegian forces being organized in Britain. These men were determined to play their part in freeing their country from the Nazi yoke. But in May 1940, before the fighting in Norway was over, a small group of Norwegians had arrived in Britain. Through a British naval intelligence agent who had travelled with them, the authorities agreed that they should return to Norway with a radio transmitter and report on German naval movements. Consequently, this group returned in a fishing vessel and set up an intelligence network covering the coast between Bergen and Kristiansand. The first Fjord watches functioned well for 2 months, but the group was then betrayed by a former Norwegian Air Force officer, and all were sentenced to death. Meanwhile, in London, an agreement was made between the British government and King Haakon's government in exile to share Norwegian intelligence. The result of this was that 6 Norwegian officers were put through a crash course in codes, radio, and German military equipment by the British Secret Intelligence Service. Four of these men, with 2 radios, were to depart from Peterhead in northern Scotland and set up 2 clandestine radio stations, Skylark B in Trondheim and Skylark A in Oslo. The men departed in the fishing vessel Nordlys on the 7th of September 1940 and made their way across the North Sea to their homeland. Both stations experienced problems in establishing communications with London. However, Skylark B did eventually succeed in making contact early in 1941. Its first significant success came in May of that year. On the 18th of that month, the German battleship Bismarck and cruiser Prince Eugen sailed from the Baltic to harry the British shipping lanes in the North Atlantic. British naval intelligence was able to monitor their progress as far as a fjord near Bergen. Thereafter, fog bedeviled RAF reconnaissance flights, and the trail went cold. On the 22nd, however, Skylark B reported the arrival of 3 German destroyers at Trondheim. These had been escorting Bismarck and Prince Eugen, although the Fjord watchers did not know this. This information helped the British to deduce that the 2 ships were aiming for the Denmark Strait. This enabled them to deploy a naval squadron to intercept them. While this resulted in the sinking of the battlecruiser Hood, the German ships were thwarted. More important, a few days later, Bismarck was cornered and sunk. But London also asked Skylark B to investigate the production of heavy water at the Norsk Hydro's hydroelectric plant at Vemork, west of Oslo. Agents interviewed Norsk employees, who first suspected that the inquiries had been initiated by a rival firm in Britain. Eventually, the agents established that the Germans were taking the heavy water back to a research institute in Berlin. This gave British intelligence vital information on German progress towards developing an atomic weapon. In February 1943, a British-based Norwegian Special Forces unit made a successful raid on Vemork. That November, the US 8th Air Force also made an effective attack on it. This halted heavy water production at the plant. Finally, Norwegian Special Operations Executive agents sank a ferry taking the remaining heavy water stocks to Germany. This marked the end of German efforts to produce an atomic bomb. But during the summer of 1941, the Gestapo had gradually closed in on Skylark B. they pounced in September, capturing many members of the network, although one or two did manage to get away and return to Britain via Sweden. On the 22nd of June 1941, however, Hitler had invaded the Soviet Union, and his forces advanced rapidly eastwards. In order to bolster the Russians, British and American weapons were sent to them by sea from September 1941 onwards. The convoys sailed to the northern Soviet ports of Archangel and Murmansk. It was not until the end of the year that the Germans began to react, by deploying more U-boats to Norway so that they could harry these convoys. More serious, surface warships, including the mighty battleship Tirpitz, the sister ship of Bismarck, were sent to Norway. The deployment of these ships caused further radio teams to be sent to Norway. By now, a forward base for Norwegian operations had been set up at Lerwick in the Shetland Islands. During the winter months, when the hours of darkness were long, fishing boats frequently plied their way to Norway and back. They became known as the Shetland Bus. During the summer months, insertion by parachute, Catalina flying boat, submarine and motor torpedo boat were used. The Fjord watchers sent back a stream of reports on the movements of German shipping. This often enabled the RAF to attack convoys and individual vessels.
Ships along whole length of Fjord. Attack is planned, over. Break immediate, Polestar 1. Thank you.
The first news of the arrival of Tirpitz in Norwegian waters was given by Station Theta, which was located in the Bergen area. But soon the Fjord watchers' reports indicated that the major German warships were being deployed ever further north to threaten the convoys to Russia. Tirpitz became their most vital prey as she moved first to Narvik and then to Kafjord by the North Cape. Further radio stations were therefore set up, and one of these, Upsilon, was established at Tromsø. Another was Libra in the Lofoten Islands. Soon there was good coverage of the whole of Norway's long coastline, but life for the Fjord watchers was by no means easy. Always fearful of an Allied invasion of Norway, the Germans had over 300,000 troops stationed in the country. This fear was encouraged by the Allies in order to prevent these forces being deployed elsewhere. The Gestapo was very active, and a number of stations were lost when their transmissions were pinpointed through radio direction finding. Often the stations had to rely on the help of local people in order to maintain their existence. The vast majority did this willingly, even though they knew that they risked draconian punishment if the Germans caught them. Inevitably, though, there were a few who were prepared to betray their fellow countrymen. Some stations, out of necessity, had to be deployed to remote areas. They were forced literally to live off the land in order to survive, but their native hardiness saw them through. 1942 was a grim year for the Arctic convoys to Russia. Losses of ships rose rapidly, and and culminated in July, when convoy PQ-17 lost 23 out of its 33 merchant vessels after they had been ordered to scatter through fear that Tirpitz and other warships were about to attack them. The British Admiralty might, however, have had a clearer picture of the true situation if poor ionospheric conditions had not prevented Norwegian radio stations from reaching London. The threat posed by the German warships in Norway was of greater concern than anything else to the British home fleet. Tirpitz remained the main worry. From August to October 1942, she was at Narvik, but then she sailed to Trondheim for an overhaul. After this, Tirpitz returned to Fjord in the extreme north. Here, the radio spies were asked to obtain details of the torpedo nets which protected her. An agent did this by pretending to fish for cod in a small boat. German suspicions were allayed because fish was a staple food of the Norwegians. Thus, the agent was able to make sketches which were then smuggled into Sweden and sent to London via the British naval attaché in Stockholm. The reason for this request was that the British were preparing an audacious operation using midget submarines to sink Tirpitz and the battlecruiser Scharnhorst. These X-craft, as they were called, were towed across the North Sea by conventional submarines, but only 4 of them reached Norwegian waters. On the 22nd of September 1943, 2 of the X-craft located and attacked Tirpitz, attaching explosive charges to her hull. They succeeded in putting her main turbines and fire control system out of action. The radio spies reported this back to London, as well as the fact that the 2 X-craft crews had been made prisoner. But Scharnhorst was still very much alive. Fjord watchers reported her putting to sea on Christmas Day in 1943. Her target, a Russian convoy of 22 ships. But also at sea was Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser flying his flag in the battleship Duke of York, with 4 cruisers and 4 destroyers. It was just the news he was waiting for. Assisted by RAF aircraft listening into Luftwaffe radio transmissions and Ultra, the British ability to crack high-level coded traffic, Fraser was able to intercept Scharnhorst on the following day. During the ensuing engagement, the German battlecruiser was sunk with all hands. A grateful Admiralty sent the radio spies the following message: "Congratulations on Scharnhorst. Tirpitz is the top of the wedding cake." For this ship was now the one remaining surface threat. The Fjord watchers closely monitored the progress of her repairs in Fjord. They also noted the large number of anti-aircraft guns which had been deployed to protect her. The Admiralty decided that she must be destroyed before she ventured out of her anchorage. Accordingly, a carrier task force was deployed. Early on the 3rd of April 1944, aircraft took off and succeeded in reaching Tirpitz before her protective smoke candles had time to cover the ship. During the attacks, the aircraft hit her with 15 armor-piercing bombs. But as agent Torstein Rabi reported, only one of these had penetrated the ship's armored deck. He estimated that some 450 casualties had been inflicted on her crew. Rabi was now sent back to Britain for a rest, but so impressed was Fraser by his reports that he invited him to dine on board Duke of York. Further carrier aircraft attacks were made against Tirpitz in July and August 1944. Their bombs, however, were clearly not large enough to penetrate the ship. The task was therefore handed over to the RAF's Crack 617 squadron, which had gained immortal fame for its attacks on the Ruhr dams in May 1943, and 9 Squadron, another very experienced Lancaster squadron. Unable to reach Alton Fjord from any airfield in the British Isles, the 2 squadrons flew via Norway, Sweden and Finland to the Russian airfield at Jagodnik, near Archangel. They took off from here on the 15th of September, armed with massive 12,000-pound tallboy armor-piercing bombs. Protective smoke prevented the crews from seeing the results of their attack on Tirpitz. Post-raid photographic reconnaissance was bedeviled by cloud. But 2 radio spies observed the attack and were able to report to London that further casualties had been inflicted on Tirpitz's crew and that her bows had been blown off. The Fjord watchers then monitored the ship's departure from Alton Fjord and arrival at Tromsø. This placed Tirpitz within bomber range of northern Scotland. And on the 29th of October 1944, 9 and 617 squadrons took off from here. This time, cloud prevented any hits on Tirpitz. The 2 squadrons tried again on the 12th of November. This time a watching agent transmitted a message. It read, "Tirpitz capsized after series of hits. A little of the side and keel is above water." The German naval surface threat, which had concentrated the attention of the radio spies for so long, was now at an end. But there was still work to be done. For by now, Soviet forces were advancing into Finnmark, in the extreme north of Norway. Radio stations were deployed here in order to report on the German withdrawal, which was accompanied by the destruction of everything that might be of any use to the Russians. But there were also fears that the Germans might turn Norway into a Festung, or stronghold, and try to resist here until the last. Their forces in the country were still formidable. More and more stations were thus established in order to gain as much information as possible on the German intentions. One agent involved was Thor Heyerdahl, who would win post-war fame for his voyage on the balsa wood raft Kon-Tiki. But on the evening of the 7th of May 1945, the German military commander in Norway announced a ceasefire, and British forces were able to fly in to take the German surrender. Norwegians in Oslo and other cities and towns celebrated the end of 5 years of Nazi occupation. But at the time, hardly any of them had any idea of the debt that they owed to their radio spies. From the fastnesses of the fjords, they had provided invaluable intelligence. These men were among the bravest of the brave, and they received many Norwegian and British awards for their courage. But only recently has the veil of secrecy been lifted to reveal the huge contribution they made to Allied victory.